Have you ever felt like God is calling you to something that just feels impossible? How do you obey when everything around you screams fear, doubt, and human logic? According to a global study with Christians, over 70% said they've held back from taking a step of faith because they were afraid of failing. That shows a deep issue in our spirituality. We trust God only when the ground feels solid. But real faith starts when the ground disappears. In the Bible, we find one of the most powerful stories of radical faith, Peter walking on water. Just a regular guy, caught in a real storm, who had the courage to step out of the boat when Jesus simply said one word, "Come." He didn't ask for proof, didn't demand answers, he just trusted. But what does this story teach us about hearing God's voice and knowing His will when faith feels crazy? This video is for you, the one stuck in the boat, looking at Jesus, but afraid to sink. It's for the one who already tried walking on water, and fell, thinking God was disappointed. We're going to go step by step through this journey of spiritual growth, looking at Peter's mistakes, his wins, and how we can apply all of it to our lives today. You're going to realize that being afraid doesn't mean you don't have faith. The problem is letting fear make the decisions for you. Get ready to see yourself in Peter's story, and more importantly, learn from him. We're going to break through whatever's keeping you stuck in the boat, and finally walk toward the extraordinary with God. By the end of this video, you won't be the same. Because when faith feels impossible, that's when the impossible becomes the stage for God's glory. So go ahead and drop a comment below. What step of faith is God asking you to take today? I'd love to read your story, pray for you, and walk with you on this journey of faith. Have you ever felt, deep in your soul, that God is calling you to something big, but it feels completely out of reach? That kind of calling isn't uncommon in the Christian life. In fact, that's exactly how God works. He invites us out of our comfort zone so we can fully depend on Him. That's what happened with Peter. He heard Jesus calling, and that's when the impossible began. The setting couldn't have been worse: strong winds, rough waters, and a dark night. That's exactly how a lot of people feel in the middle of a personal crisis. And that's often when God's voice shows up. You know why? Because when everything feels like it's falling apart, our spiritual sensitivity kicks in. That's when we're finally ready to really hear His voice and see His will more clearly. Peter was in the boat with the other disciples, probably tired and scared. When he saw Jesus walking on water, he thought it was a ghost. That just shows how even those closest to Jesus can misread spiritual signs when fear takes over. What changed everything was when Peter said, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you." That's when the impossible called him by name. Peter's request wasn't just bold, it was an act of trust. He wanted confirmation, yes, but he was also ready to obey. That's what real relationship with God looks like. It's not just about hearing, it's about responding. And here's a powerful truth: God doesn't call the ready, He prepares the ones who respond. Peter didn't know how to walk on water, but he knew how to trust. How many times have we missed out on a miracle because we waited to understand everything before obeying? Faith isn't about logic, it's about trust. And trusting God is a daily choice, especially when everything around you looks uncertain. Sometimes, what looks like madness to the world is actually God's direction. The Bible is full of stories like that, like Abraham, who left everything without even knowing where he was going. Maybe today, God is calling you to take a step that feels impossible, forgiving someone, quitting a job, starting a ministry, or simply trusting Him through the pain. If the calling is from God, the provision will be too. Spiritual strength doesn't come just from long prayers, but from simple obedience. God calls us by name, and waits for our response. So pause for a moment and think, what's the boat you need to leave in order to obey God's voice? That's the first step from theory to living the supernatural. Stick with me in the next chapter as we explore how God uses storms to train us. It's interesting to notice that Peter's calling didn't come on a sunny, peaceful day. It didn't happen during a calm church service or a quiet moment of worship. Jesus called Peter right in the middle of a storm. And that teaches us something deep. God often speaks the loudest in the noise of chaos. Because it's when everything is out of our control that we truly learn to depend on Him. The Bible describes that moment as a rough sea, with strong winds, and the disciples were already exhausted from rowing. That sea perfectly reflects the spiritual life of so many people today, tired, confused, afraid, and feeling like God is far away. But it was in that exact moment of desperation that Jesus showed up. He comes to us even when everything feels like it's falling apart. The storm wasn't a detour, it was part of the process. How often do we assume that being in crisis means God has abandoned us? But it's actually the opposite. God uses the storm to reveal His presence in a more powerful way. It's in those moments when our strength runs out that the supernatural begins. Some of the most life-changing reflections in Scripture are born in the middle of the waves. Peter was surrounded by fear. The other disciples were shouting, the wind was hitting his face, the water was crashing against the boat, everything seemed to be working against faith. And still, it was in that environment that he had enough faith to say, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you. That teaches us something powerful. The chaos around us doesn't have to define the faith within us. Sometimes we're waiting for things to calm down before we take a step of faith. But Jesus didn't wait for the storm to stop before calling Peter. That's deeply revealing. He's teaching us to walk on top of the chaos, to keep our eyes on Him even when the waves don't let up. That's when our relationship with God deepens, when we walk by faith, not by sight. And what if I told you that your current storm might actually be an invitation to a miracle? That this season of chaos might be the stage where God is about to show up in a brand new way in your life. Both the Bible and real-life testimonies show that the most powerful encounters with God often happen in our most desperate moments. We just have to be paying attention. So maybe, instead of asking God to calm the storm, we should ask, Lord, teach me to walk on it. Because it's right there, in the middle of the crashing waves, that He shows us who He really is. And if you think that kind of faith is impossible, just wait until you understand the power in a single word from Jesus, come. And it was that one word, come, that changed everything. There was no speech, no detailed plan, just a direct call from Jesus. One word that broke through all human logic. Because honestly, who in their right mind would try to walk on water during a storm? But that's where the mystery of faith lies. It's never about what makes sense, it's about who's calling you. Peter didn't ask for the storm to calm down before stepping out. He just wanted to be sure it was really Jesus. And when he heard, "Come," that was enough. That's how we learn to hear God's voice and discern His will. It doesn't always come with details, but it always comes with authority. When it's God speaking, your soul knows, even when your mind doesn't understand. How many times has God called you to something that didn't make sense? To forgive someone who hurt you, to give up something safe, to serve where no one else wants to. These are the kinds of callings that don't fit into worldly logic, but they reveal the heart of the gospel. God is always inviting us into something bigger, something that pulls us out of our comfort zones. And we can only respond with faith when we trust Him more than we trust our circumstances. The problem is, we've been taught to chase safety, not obedience. But real safety is found in obeying, even when everything feels unsafe. Peter got that, for a moment. He trusted Jesus' voice more than he trusted the ground beneath him. And that's the turning point for any believer, when you realize that God's voice holds you up more than the ground you're standing on. Have you ever noticed how God rarely gives all the details? He told Abraham, "Leave your country, and go to the land I will show you." With Moses, it was simply, "Go to Pharaoh." With Peter, "Come." God doesn't hand us maps, He gives us direction. That's what a relationship with Him looks like, trusting the one who leads more than the path itself. Faith isn't about knowing everything. It's about following even when you know nothing. And that's exactly where many people give up. They want to hear God, but they only obey if it all makes sense. But real spirituality begins when we stop depending on reason and start moving by revelation. The Bible is full of inspiring stories like this, people who left everything behind for a word, a promise, a calling. Maybe today God is saying just one thing to you: come. That's it. No explanations, no guarantees. Just His voice. And now the question is, will you respond like Peter, or are you still waiting for the sea to calm down? Because the kind of faith that transforms your life begins with one step out of the boat. And in the next chapter, we're walking with Peter through that first step, the scariest and most freeing step of all. And then, Peter went. One step. One moment of pure surrender. He stepped out of the boat, and for the first time in history, someone walked on water, not supported by logic, but by faith in a single word: come. That first step is the dividing line between those who simply hear God's voice and those who dare to obey it. And most Christians stop right there, frozen between the calling and the courage. Peter knew he couldn't walk on water by himself. But he trusted that if it was Jesus who called him, then there was power in that call. The Bible shows us that a step of faith is never about human ability, it's about trusting the character of God. It's not about where you step, but who's calling you. Spiritual strength is born when we take steps that pull us out of our comfort and control. This scene gives you chills. The wind is still blowing, the waves are still crashing, and yet Peter steps out of the boat. That shows us faith isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to move forward in the middle of fear. True spirituality isn't made of perfect moments, but of bold steps in imperfect ones. And when you dare to walk by faith, you experience the supernatural in ways you never could from inside the boat. How many people are living a safe, but stuck, version of Christianity? They want miracles, but not risk. They want to hear God's voice, but don't want to move when they hear it. Peter didn't have any guarantees, it was just faith. And that's why his story stands out in the Bible. Because faith is action, not just emotion. And heaven responds when your feet leave the comfort of solid ground. Of course, that step of faith doesn't mean everything will suddenly be easy. In fact, the first step is usually the hardest. But it's also the most powerful. Because it breaks through fear, doubt, and spiritual passivity. It marks the beginning of a new journey with God, where every step forward is held up by His presence, not your own strength. That's what it means to live by faith and not by sight. If you feel like God is calling you to something big, but fear is holding you back, remember Peter. He didn't wait until he felt 100% ready. He just responded. And that's exactly what God is asking of us, to trust the calling more than the circumstances. The miracle doesn't start when the storm calms down. It starts when you dare to step out of the boat. But oh, how easy it is to start well and then suddenly stumble. Because even while walking on water, Peter had a moment when he took his eyes off Jesus. And that's where we're headed next in this journey. Let's take a look at what happens when your focus shifts away from Christ, the beginning of the fall. And then, right in the middle of the miracle, something happens. Peter, who had been walking on water, begins to sink. But what changed? The waves were still there. So was the wind. What changed was his focus. He took his eyes off Jesus. And here lies one of the most painful, and most necessary, lessons in the Christian life. The miracle isn't just about taking the first step, it's about keeping your eyes fixed on the one who called you. It's easy to start the journey full of passion, but faith is truly tested in the long run. The Bible says the righteous live by faith, not just choose it in a moment, but walk in it daily. Peter looked away for just a moment, and that moment was enough for fear to come rushing back. The same fear he had already conquered in the boat was now pulling him under in the sea. How often does this happen to us? We start strong. We take steps of faith, we trust, we pray, we listen to God and obey, but then we look at the bills, the diagnosis, the rejection, the storm around us. And fear paralyzes us. That doesn't mean your faith is gone. It just means it needs to be realigned. A relationship with God isn't about perfection, it's about focus. Peter didn't sink because he failed. He sank because he got distracted. And that's something we all need to understand. Spiritual distractions are dangerous. They're subtle, quiet, but powerful. That's why it's so important to stay rooted in the Word, remember the promise, and keep our eyes on Jesus. Because everything around us will try to convince us the storm is stronger than the calling. But it's not. When we take our eyes off Jesus, we make room for doubt. And where doubt lives, faith starts to fade. That's the moment we have to act fast. Recognize the shift, cry out for help, and refocus on the only one who has the power to hold us up. The Bible shows us that even the greatest men and women of God had moments of falling. What set them apart was how they responded. Peter didn't try to swim on his own. He did what we all should do in the moment of the fall, he cried out. And that changed everything. Because God never turns away a heart that's broken and humble. Maybe that's where you are right now. You started strong, but somewhere along the way, you lost focus. The good news: it's not too late to rise again. There's still grace. There's still a hand reaching out to you. And that's exactly where we get to the most emotional part of this story. Because when Peter started to sink, he shouted, "Lord, save me." And Jesus didn't hesitate. He reached out immediately. And it was in that exact moment, somewhere between sinking and desperation, that Peter did what every believer should do when it feels like everything's slipping out of control. He cried out. It wasn't a long, polished prayer. It was a cry. A desperate shout born from fear, but also from faith. "Lord, save me." 3 words that carry the weight of the human soul, and the hope of divine intervention. This is the kind of prayer God always hears. The Bible is full of stories of men and women who cried out at their limit, and heaven responded. Because God doesn't move based on our performance, He moves in response to our hearts. It doesn't matter if you're sinking because of fear, mistakes, or weakness. What matters is that you still have a voice to cry out. Our relationship with God becomes most real in moments like these. When we can't pretend to be strong anymore. When we drop the act. When crying for help is our only option. Peter wasn't ashamed to look weak. He didn't try to save himself. He just cried out, trusting that Jesus was still there. And that is faith. Not perfect faith, but real faith. The kind that admits it needs help. Maybe that's where you are right now, feeling like you're sinking. Sinking in discouragement, in doubt, in sin, in anxiety. And maybe you've started to believe that God is too far to hear you. But He's not. God is the Father who runs toward the child who cries out. The hand of Jesus doesn't hesitate. The love of Jesus doesn't waver. All it takes is one honest cry for Him to move in power. And you know what's even more beautiful? Jesus didn't wait for Peter to deserve being rescued. He didn't say, "You should have trusted more," before reaching out. He saved him first. Then He taught him. That's the heart of our God. He prioritizes rescue over rebuke. Spiritual strength also grows from this truth. God doesn't give up on those who fall, He lifts them up in love. This scene challenges us, but it also comforts us. Because so often we think we have to be perfect to deserve divine help. But Jesus moves even in the middle of our mess. What matters is recognizing the need, lifting your voice, and crying out, "Lord, save me." It doesn't matter where you fell, what matters is whether you want to get back up. And when the hand of Jesus reaches you, everything changes. The fall becomes a testimony. Weakness turns into strength. Fear transforms into faith. And that's exactly what we'll see in the next chapter, when the outstretched hand reveals a God who's never late, even when everything feels lost. And in that exact moment, before Peter could go completely under, Jesus' hand reached out. Quick, steady, strong. Because when God decides to move, He doesn't hesitate. And here's a truth that brings peace to anxious hearts: our God is never late. He shows up right when a desperate cry turns into faith. Even when everything seems lost, his hand is already on the way. It's hard not to feel something deep when you picture this scene. The sea is still raging. The wind is still blowing hard. But there's Jesus, holding Peter, proving that even when our faith fails, God's love never does. That's what sets the gospel apart from any other belief system. It's not about us reaching up to God, it's about Him coming down to us, reaching into our mess, and lifting us up with grace. How many times have we thought God was late, when in reality He arrived at the exact right moment? God's timing doesn't follow our clocks, but it always responds to a sincere cry. There are so many real-life testimonies of people rescued at the very last second, just like Peter. Because God's goal is never to watch us sink, but to teach us to trust Him, even when everything else fails. And when Jesus reaches out His hand, He doesn't just pull us up, He repositions us. He lifts us out of fear and places us back on the path of faith. That's what spiritual growth looks like, falling, then rising with a deeper understanding and stronger, more mature faith. The hand that rescues is the same hand that restores. And once it grabs hold, it doesn't let go. Our relationship with God grows the most in these moments. Because it's in the fall that we realize we're never alone, even in failure. God doesn't abandon us in our mistakes. He steps into the chaos, holds us tight, lifts us up, and says, "Let's keep going." There's no condemnation, just grace. And that grace changes everything. It gives us the courage to try again, to move forward, to trust even more than before. When Peter was lifted up, he wasn't scolded in anger. Jesus pulled him close and corrected him with love. And that's a powerful reminder. God's correction isn't meant to push us away, it's meant to draw us closer to His heart. The hand that lifts also teaches. And that's exactly what we'll see in the next chapter, when Jesus looks Peter in the eye and says, "You of little faith." And then, with Peter safe in His hands, Jesus looked at him and said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" It wasn't a rebuke. It was an invitation to reflect. A question that cuts deep into the soul and reveals God's heart. He doesn't just want to save us from sinking, He wants to teach us how to swim by faith. That moment of correction didn't push Peter away, it brought him closer. Jesus didn't say Peter had no faith. He said it was little. That tells us something powerful. Even shaky, imperfect faith is still faith. And God honors every seed, every try, every trembling step in the right direction. Spiritual growth comes through that process, messing up, learning, and growing. Jesus' correction doesn't shame, it shines light on the path to a deeper relationship with God. Mature spirituality understands that being corrected by God is a blessing, not a punishment. The Bible shows us that God corrects those He loves. And the way He does it is always full of grace. He doesn't expose us. He doesn't reject us. He teaches us. Peter heard those words, and instead of pulling away, he stayed close to Jesus. Because when love is real, even correction draws us near. How often do we confuse correction with rejection? We think God is punishing us when, in truth, He's shaping us. He's preparing us for what's ahead, for deeper waters. He confronts us not to shame us, but to strengthen us. And that changes everything. Because once we understand that, we're no longer afraid to fail, we're just afraid to miss the lesson. Jesus knew Peter had a major role to play in the future of the church. He saw beyond that moment of weakness. He saw the man who would preach to crowds, heal the sick, lead God's people. And it was in this exact moment, right in the middle of Peter's struggle, that Jesus planted a lesson that would last forever. A lesson that still speaks today: faith may be small, but when it's in Christ, it's enough. That correction produced fruit. Peter didn't walk away feeling humiliated, he walked away transformed. He experienced the strength and gentleness of Jesus at the same time. And it shaped him. The impulsive man began turning into a rock-solid leader. That's what happens in the presence of Jesus. He confronts us, rescues us, teaches us, and then sends us out with a new heart. And speaking of returning, that's exactly what happens next. Peter and Jesus walk back to the boat together. But Peter isn't the same. He's coming back with a more grounded, more real kind of faith. And in the next chapter, we'll dive into that moment of restoration, the return to the boat, coming back changed. And then, hand in hand with Jesus, Peter returns to the boat. But he's not the same man who stepped out just a few minutes earlier. He had faced the impossible, stumbled in fear, cried out for help, and felt the hand of God lift him up. The miracle wasn't just walking on water, it was coming back with a transformed heart. Because that's what grace does, it doesn't just rescue us, it renews us. That walk back must have been quiet, but full of meaning. Step by step, no longer driven by impulse, but by trust. Peter didn't come back as a failure, he came back as someone who had encountered the power of God's presence in the middle of a fall. That's what real relationship with God looks like. He doesn't define us by our weakest moments, but by what we learn through them. When Peter steps back into the boat, he brings something with him that none of the other disciples had, the experience of walking, even if just for a moment, on the water with Jesus. That's how powerful testimonies are born. Not from easy wins, but from battles fought in the middle of storms. Because true spirituality is built on scars, not on appearances. The other disciples watch. And it's a powerful image. Peter is soaked, breathless, maybe even a little embarrassed, but he's closer to Jesus than ever. Yes, he failed. But he failed while trying to obey. And that's more honorable than never stepping out of the boat at all. It's better to sink trusting God than to live your whole life safe, but distant from His will. Restoration happens in the quiet of the return. The Bible doesn't record any words from Peter in that moment, but his heart was being deeply shaped. And the most beautiful part: Jesus never let go of his hand. He walked with him all the way back. That reminds us, God doesn't walk away after the crisis. He stays. He leads. He keeps writing our story, even after our worst falls. That return to the boat represents something powerful, the chance to start again. How many times have we believed that after failing, God is done with us? But He's not. He turns the fall into strength. And the man who stepped back into that boat wasn't just a fisherman anymore, he was someone forever marked by a personal encounter with God's faithfulness. And that transformation didn't go unnoticed. What comes next is even more extraordinary. The other disciples, witnessing it all, respond in worship. In the next chapter, we'll see how one person's faith can impact many, the reverence of those still in the boat, and the ripple effect of lived-out faith. As Peter returned to the boat, something powerful was happening in the hearts of those who had been watching. The other disciples saw it all, from the moment Peter asked to step out, to the fall, the cry for help, the rescue, and the return. They didn't experience the miracle with their feet, but they witnessed it with their eyes. And that was enough to stir reverence. The Bible says that, in that moment, they worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." It's amazing how lived-out faith, even with flaws, can deeply impact those around us. A relationship with God is never just personal, it overflows. Peter didn't preach a single sermon in that moment. He simply lived out his faith, even with stumbles. And that was enough for everyone there to have a deeper revelation of who Jesus truly was. This teaches us something powerful. Your walk with God, even imperfect, can become a living testimony. Stories of faith that inspire aren't just about spectacular victories, they're about honest steps, real struggles, and visible restoration. Someone is watching you, maybe silently, and they're being touched by how you handle life's storms. The kind of spirituality that transforms isn't the one that impresses with words, it's the one that convinces through action. When you stay in faith after sinking, when you rise again with humility, when you keep walking with Jesus despite the scars, that preaches louder than any message. Spiritual strength is contagious. And in that boat, everyone was impacted. Picture the scene: the wind dies down, the sea calms, Peter's drenched and silent, Jesus by his side, and the others, in awe, worshipping. That's the power of bold faith. That's what happens when someone is willing to step out of the boat. One person takes the risk, but everyone is edified. One obeys, and everyone is moved to worship. That's God's design, for our faith to shine light for others. If you think your story is too simple or too messy to make a difference, remember Peter. He wasn't perfect, but he was real. He was transparent. And because of that, he became a vessel for transformation. The Bible is full of people just like him, ordinary men and women used by God to do extraordinary things. And it all started with one step of faith, even a shaky one. And if one step of faith can create that much impact, imagine what happens when God calls you to step out again. Yes, because God's purpose doesn't stop at one miracle. He continues. He calls again. He leads us into new challenges. And that's what we'll talk about next, as we wrap up this journey with the most powerful invitation of all. And there, in the silence that followed the worship, Peter knew something the others might not have realized yet. This wouldn't be the last time Jesus would call him to step out of the boat. Because the walk of faith isn't built on just one life-changing experience, it's built on a series of divine invitations to go further, to trust again, even after falling. God keeps calling, and every come requires a new yes. Walking with Christ is a journey of constant new beginnings. And every time he calls, it's another opportunity to go deeper in your relationship with God. Peter would step out of many more boats. He'd step out to walk among the sick, to preach to crowds, to face prison. And in all those moments, he carried the living memory that even when he sank, Jesus reached for him. The Bible shows us that faith isn't a straight line. It's filled with curves, valleys, mountaintops, moments of glory, and moments of pain. But when you learn to hear God's voice and discern His will, you also learn to obey, even when you can't see the ground beneath your feet. You learn to trust, even when your heart is trembling. You learn that when God calls, your place isn't in the boat, it's out on the water. Maybe you've already experienced a miracle. Maybe you've answered a calling before. But now, you feel frozen, afraid of falling again. Let me remind you, the same God who lifted you once is ready to call you again. He hasn't labeled you by your fall, He's equipping you for your comeback. Spiritual strength comes from making the choice to obey, one more time. That's why this video doesn't end with Peter returning to the boat. It ends with an invitation to you. An invitation to step out of your boat, whatever that is, your comfort zone, fear, doubt, sin, or indecision. God is calling you today. And the question that echoes now is the same one that echoed in Peter's heart: do you trust me? If your answer is yes, then don't wait for the sea to calm down. Take the step. The impossible is still the stage for God's miracles. And your life could be the next testimony that inspires others. Because the kind of faith that feels impossible is the same faith that moves the heart of the Father. And this is the moment when everything comes together. The calling, the storm, the step of faith, the fall, the cry, the outstretched hand, the correction, the return to the boat, the worship, every part of it was a divinely orchestrated process meant to reveal something much greater: who God is, and who we become when we trust in Him. It's not just about walking on water, it's about learning to live by the Word. Peter began this story as an impulsive disciple, curious, unsure, with shaky faith. But he ended it with a surrendered heart, shaped by experience. And the same is true for us. God uses our trembling attempts to forge unshakable faith. He turns our failures into lasting lessons and our fear into strength that encourages others. That's how a real relationship with God is built. If today faith feels impossible, if that next step feels like more than you can handle, remember, Peter didn't walk on water because he was strong. He walked because he chose to trust. And that same choice is right in front of you right now. Start small. Start afraid. Start unsure. But start. The God who's calling you is the same God who will hold you up. Now it's your turn. What's the boat you need to leave today? What step is God asking you to take? Drop it in the comments. I want to hear your story, pray for you, and together build this community of faith. If this video touched your heart, give it a like, share it with someone frozen in fear, and subscribe so we can keep walking this journey together. And remember, God's voice still says, "Come." And the invitation is personal. You don't have to be perfect, just willing. Because when faith feels impossible, that's exactly when heaven starts to move. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, like this video, and share it with someone who needs a word of faith. And in the comments, answer this. What step of faith is God asking you to take today?